Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large cabinet to his left. He shot into it and pulled aside the door closed, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, the bell rang, and Malfoy stepped into the shop. Two men followed. The man followed could only be Draco's father. He had the same pale, pointed face and identical cold, gray eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop, looked lazily at one item on the display, and rang the bell on the counter before turning to his son, saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." "I said I would buy you a racing broom," his father said, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What's the good of that if I'm not on the house team?" said Malfoy, looking sulky and bad-tempered. "Harry Potter got his Nimbus 2000 last year and special permission from Dumbledore so he could play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous. Famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine the shelf full of skulls. "Everybody thinks he's so smart and wonderful, Potter, with a scar and his broomstick." "You have told me this at least a dozen times already," said Mr. Malfoy with a quelling look at his son, "and I would remind you that it is not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter, not when most of our kind regard him as a hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin." A stooping man appeared behind the counter, smoothing his greasy hair back from his face. "Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again," Mr. Borgin said in a voice only as oily as his hair. "Delighted. And young Master Malfoy, too. Charmed. How may I be of assistance? May I show you just in today? A very reasonable price. I'm not buying today, Mr. Borgin, but selling," said Mr. Malfoy. "Selling?" The smile faded slightly from Mr. Borgin's face. "You have heard, of course, that the Ministry of Magic is conducting more raids," said Mr. Malfoy, taking a roll of parchment from his inside pocket and unraveling it for Mr. Borgin to read. "I have a few, items that I might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call." Mr. Borgin fixed a pair of pince nez on his nose and looked down at the list. "Oh, the Ministry wouldn't presume to trouble with you, sir, surely," said Mr. Malfoy's lip curled. "I have not been visited yet. The name Malfoy still commands a certain respect. Yet the Ministry of Magic grows ever more meddlesome, and the rumors are out there with the Muggle Protection Act. No doubt the flea-bitten, Muggle-loving fool Arthur Weasley is behind it." Harry felt a hot surge of anger. "And you see, certain of these poisons might make it appear—" "I understand, sir, of course," said Mr. Borgin. "Let me see." "Can I have that?" interrupted Draco, pointing to the withered hand on its cushion. "Ah, the Hand of Glory," said Mr. Borgin, abandoning Mr. Malfoy's list, scurrying over to Draco. "Insert a candle, and it gives light only to the holder. Best friend of thieves and plunderers. Your son has fine taste, sir." "I hope my son would amount to more than the thief and a plunderer, Borgin," said Mr. Malfoy coldly. And Mr. Borgin said quickly, "Oh, no offense, sir. No offense meant." "Though, if his grades don't pick up," said Mr. Malfoy, more coldly still, "that may be indeed all he is fit for." "It's not my fault," retorted Draco. "The teachers all have favored that Hermione Granger." "I would have thought that you would be ashamed that a girl of no wizard family beat you in every exam," snapped Mr. Malfoy. "Ha!" Harry said under his breath, pleased to see Draco looking both abashed and angry. "It's the same all over," said Mr. Borgin, his oily voice. "Wizard blood is becoming less and less everywhere. Counting for less and less everywhere." "Not with me," said Mr. Malfoy. his long nostrils flaring. "No, sir, not with me, sir," said Mr. Borgin with a deep bow. "In that case, perhaps you can to return to my list," said Mr. Malfoy shortly. "I'm in something of a hurry, Borgin. I have important business elsewhere today." They started to haggle. Harry watched nervously as Draco drew near and near and nearer to his hiding place, examining the objects for sale. Draco paused to examine a long coil of a hangman's rope, to read, smirking, the card propped up against a magnificent necklace of opals. "Caution, do not touch, cursed." He claimed the lives of 19 Muggle owners to date. Draco turned away and saw the cabinet right in front of him. He walked forward. He outstretched his hand for the handle. "Done," said Mr. Malfoy to the corner. "Come, Draco." Harry wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and Draco turned away. "Good day to you, Mr. Borgin. I'll expect you at my manor tomorrow to come pick up the goods." The moment the door closed, Mr. Borgin dropped his oily manner. "Good day yourself, Mr. Malfoy. And if the stories are true, you haven't told me half of what you have hidden in your manor." Muttering darkly, Mr. Borgin disappeared into the back room. He waited for a minute, in case he came back. Quickly as he could, he slipped out of the cabinet, past the glass cases, and out the shop door. Clutching his broken glasses to his face, Harry stared around. He had emerged into a dingy alleyway, which seemed to be made up entirely of shops devoted to the dark arts. The one he had just to his left of Borgin and Burke's looked like the largest, but the most opposite was a nasty window display of shrunken heads, and 2 doors down a large cage was alive with gigantic black spiders. 2 shabby-looking wizards were watching him with the shadow of a doorway. Muttering to each other, feeling jumpy, Harry set off, trying to hold his glasses straight and hoping, against hope, he'd be able to find his way out of here. An old wooden street sign hanging over the shop, spelling out poisonous candles, told him that he was in Knockturn Alley. This didn't help. Harry had never heard of such a place. He supposed he hadn't spoken clearly enough when he with his mouth full of ashes. Back in the Weasley's fire, trying to stay calm, he wondered what to do. "Not lost, are you, my dear?" said the voice in his ear, making him jump. An aged witch stood in front of him, holding a tray of what looked horribly like a human fingernails. She leered at him, showing him mossy teeth. Harry backed away. I'm fine, thanks. I'm just Harry, what are you doing here down here?" Harry's heart leapt. So did the witch. A load of fingernails cascaded down over her feet, and she cursed at the massive form of Hagrid. The Hogwarts gamekeeper came striding towards them, beetle eyes flashing over his great bristling beard. "Hagrid!" Harry said in relief. "I was lost. Flue powder." Hagrid seized Harry by the scruff of his neck, pulling him away, with the witch knocking the tray out of her hands. Her shrieks followed them all the way through the twisting alleyway, out into the bright sunlight. Harry saw a familiar snow-white marble building in the distance, Gringotts Bank. Hagrid had steered him into Diagon Alley. "You're a mess," said Hagrid gruffly, brushing soot off Harry so forcefully he nearly knocked him into the barrel of dragon dung outside the apothecary. "Sulkin' in Gringotts Alley, I dunno. Dodgy place, Harry. Don't you know? To see you down there." "I realize that," said Harry, ducking. Hagrid made brush him off again. "I told you I was lost." "What were you doing down there, anyways?" "Oh, I was looking for flesh-eating slug repellent," growled Hagrid. "They ruinin' the school cabbage." "Yet not on your own, are you?" "I'm staying with the Weasleys, but we got separated," Harry explained. "I've got to go find them." They set off together down the street. "How come you never wrote me back to me?" Hagrid said to Harry, jogged alongside him. "Because it takes take 3 steps to every one of his strides." Hagrid was enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. "Lousy muggles," growled Hagrid. "If I'd have known—" "Harry! Harry! Over here!" Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing on the top of the white flight of steps at Gringotts. She ran down to meet her, and her bushy brown hair flying behind her. "What happened to your glasses?" "Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you again. Are you coming to Gringotts, Harry?" "As soon as I found the Weasleys," said Harry. "You won't have to wait long," Hagrid said with a grin. Harry and Hermione looked around. Sprinting up the crowded streets were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. "Harry!" Mr. Weasley panted. "Oh, we'd hoped you only gone one grade too far." He mopped with his glistening bald patch. "Molly's frantic. She's coming." "Where did you come out?" Ron asked. "Knockturn Alley," said Hagrid grimly. "Excellent!" said Fred and George together. "We've never been allowed down there," said Ron enviously. "I should ruddy well think not," growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley came up into view, handbag swinging wildly at one hand. Ginny was clinging to the other. "Oh, Harry, Harry! Oh, dear! You could have been anywhere." Gasping for breath, she pulled a large clothes brush out of her bag and began sweeping off the soot. Hagrid hadn't managed to get beat away off him. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses and gave him a tap with his wand, and they returned to good as new. "Well, gotta be off," said Hagrid, who was having his hand wrung by Mrs. Weasley. "Knockturn Alley! If you hadn't found him, Hagrid!" "See you at Hogwarts." He strode away, head and shoulders above anybody else. Then the packed street. "Guess who I saw on boarding in books?" Harry asked Ron and Hermione as they climbed the Gringotts steps. "Malfoy and his father." "Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything?" said Mr. Weasley sharply behind him. "No, he was selling." "Ha ha! So he's wide," said Mr. Weasley with a grin of satisfaction. "Oh, I'd love to see get Lucius Malfoy for something." "You be careful, Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley sharply as they were bowed into the bank and the goblin at the door. "The family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew." "So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy?" said Mr. Weasley indignantly. But he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. "But you're muggles," said Mr. Weasley delightedly. "We must have a drink." "What's that you've got there? Oh, you're changing muggle money. Oh, Molly, look!" And he pointed excitedly to the 10-pound notes at Mr. Granger's hand. "Meet you back here," Ron said to Hermione, as the Weasleys and Harry were led off to the underground vaults by another Gringotts goblin. The vaults were reached by means of small, goblin-driven carts, and they sped along the miniature train tracks along the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful when the fat worse than he had the Knockturn Alley when it opened. There was a very small pile of silver sickles inside, just one gold galleon, and Mrs. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping a whole lot into her bag. Harry even felt worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view, but he hastily shoved handfuls of coins into the leather bag. Back outside of the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George unsported their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan, and Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny were going to go second-hand robe shop. Mr. Weasley was insisting that they take the Grangers out to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. "We'll all meet at Flourish and Blott's in an hour to buy your school books," said Mrs. Weasley, settling off with Ginny. "And not one step down Knockturn Alley," she shouted at the twins retreating at their backs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione strolled off along the winding cobbled street, the bag of gold, silver, and bronze jangling cheerfully in Harry's pockets. When clamoring, he brought their large strawberry peanut butter ice creams that they slurped down happily as they wandered up the alley, examining the fascinating shop windows. Ron gazed longingly at the full set of chuddy cannon robes in the windows, quality Quidditch supplies, until Hermione dragged him off to buy ink and parchment next door. In Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke Shop, they met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's fabulously wet start no heat fireworks. And in the tiny junk shop full of broken wands, lopsided brass scales, old cloaks covered in potion stains, they found Percy, deeply immersed in a small and deeply boring book, said prefects who gained power. A study of Hogwarts prefects and their later careers. Ron read off the back cover. That just sounds fascinating. Go away, Percy snapped. Of course, he's very ambitious, Percy. He's got it all planned out. He wants to be Ministry of Magic, Ron told Harry and Hermione in the undertone that as they left Percy to it. An hour later, they headed for Flourish and Blotts, where they were by no means the only ones making their way to the bookshop. As they approached it, they saw surprised large crowds jostling to the side doors trying to get in. The reason was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper window. Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing his autobiography, Magical Me, today, 12:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. We can actually meet him? Hermione squealed. I mean, he's written almost our whole book list. The crowd seemed to be made up of mostly witches around Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassed-looking wizard looking at the door, saying, "Calmly, please, ladies. Don't push there. Mind the books now." Harry and Ron and Hermione squeezed inside. A long line wound around the right back of the shop, and Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of Standard Books of Spells of Grade 2. They sneaked up the line where the rest of the Weasleys were standing and Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are. Good," said Mrs. Weasley. She sounded breathless, patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at a table, surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing in dazzling white teeth to the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue that clearly exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard hat was set jaunty angle in his wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera and emitted puffs of purple smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of the way there!" he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This is for the Daily Prophet." "Big deal," said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up and he saw Ron. And then he saw Harry. He stared and then leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be Harry Potter!" The crowd parted and whispered excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry's arm, and pulled him into front of the crowd, bursting into applause. Harry's face burned, and Lockhart shook his hand for the photographer, who was clicking away madly, wafting the thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice big smile, Harry," said Lockhart, through his own gleaming teeth. "Together, you and I are worth a front page." When he finally let go of Harry's hand, Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to sidle back with the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw his arm around his shoulders and clamped him tightly to his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving for quiet, "what an extraordinary moment this is! The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time. When young Harry Potter here stepped into Flourish and Blotts today, he was only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present him with now, free of charge." The crowd applauded again. "He had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake and made his glasses slip to the end of his nose. that he would shortly be getting much, much more details than my books, A Magical Me. He and his schoolmates will in fact be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure and pride of announcing that in September I will be taking the Defense of Dark Arts course teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The crowd cheered and clapped. Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart staggering slightly under their weight. He managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room, where Ginny was standing next to her cauldron. "You have these?" Harry muttered to her, tipping the books into her cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice who had trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't even go into a bookstore without making a front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry, and she was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny was scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy, as if he were something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry, eh?" "Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for all of those." Ron went as red as Ginny, and he dropped his books into the cauldron, too. He started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George. "What are you doing? It's too crowded in here. Let's go outside." "Well, well, well, Arthur Weasley." Now it was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hands on Draco's shoulders, sneering just the same way. "Lucius," said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. "Busy time at the Ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime." He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted from amid the glossy Lockhart books a very old, very battered copy of Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," said Malfoy. "Dear me. What's the use of being a disgrace in the name of wizardry if they don't even pay you well for it?" Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizardry, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes staring to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. "The company you keep, Weasley. I thought your family couldn't sink no lower." There was a thud of metal as Jenny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backward into the shelf, dozens of heavy spellbound books thundering down on their heads, and there was a yell, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred and George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stumbled backwards, knocking the shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please!" cried the assistant. Then louder for all, "Break up there, gents, break it up!" Hagrid was wading towards them through the sea of books. In an instant he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. By the Encyclopedia of Toadstools, he was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned Draco and swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet and straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core. The whole family. Everyone knows it. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's all. That's what it is. Now come now. He's got out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them from leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist, seemed to think better of it. They hurried up into the street, the Grangers shaking with fright and Mr. Weasley beside herself with fury. "A fine example you set for your children, brawling in public! What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought!" "He was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he was able to work in the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity." But it was subdued group that headed back into the fireside of the Leaky Cauldron, where Harry and the Weasleys and all their traveling would be back to the Barrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side, and Mr. Weasley started to ask them how the bus stop works, but stopped quickly as he looked on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses, put them safely in his pockets before helping himself to some Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way of travel.